Experts are very good at telling us that if we want success and happiness, we have to change ourselves. But what if you actually already possess everything you'll ever need, and all you really need to do is access the gifts you've already got to become the person you already are? I mean, my story began on a council estate or project in West London. I wouldn't say it was rough, but even the dogs had pepper sprays. And I remember as a child being fearful. There was an atmosphere of fear in the house. But perhaps they had good cause to be a bit fearful because they were very deeply impacted by the death of their first child. My parents had been stationed in what's now Israel. And on the 28th of January 1939, Pamela was born. 4 months later, on the 27th of May, she died from pneumonia. My father was a soldier, and the very next day they had to leave on a ship to get back to England. Second World War clouds were rumbling, so there was no option. So they had a rudimentary burial, left instructions for a headstone, but they never actually ever saw it, although they did get a photograph sometime later. So fast forward half a century to 1988, and I was organising a convention in Tel Aviv, and before I left, I had a conversation with my mother, and we realised that the cemetery was only just over an hour's drive from where I was staying, so I agreed to find the grave. So I left before dawn on a Saturday morning to avoid the traffic, and armed with a grainy black and white photograph of a little headstone, 2 tiny trees, set off in a taxi to go to the cemetery. When I got there, I was met with all the signs in Hebrew, which I don't speak, so I wasn't even sure if I was in the right place. And as I entered, it was like one of those scenes that's reminiscent of a war documentary, where the camera pans back and you see row after row of headstones on a neatly manicured green carpet of grass. And as I went in, I remember distinctly the smell of cedar and citrus in the air, and I began my search. I walked up and down. By the way, I later discovered there were over 6,000 graves there. So I walked up and down for well over an hour, probably an hour and a half. I was getting a bit desperate because I couldn't find it. And I suddenly realised I'm looking for 2 small trees. Well, 50 years on, they might have grown a bit. So I went to what looked like a more likely part of the cemetery, and I was walking up and down, still nothing. So at this point I thought, well, I've got to get back. And as I turned, the photograph caught on my thigh, and I dropped it, and the breeze caught it, and it bounced along the neatly trimmed grass. I rushed over and pinned it down, and as I bent down and looked up, I saw my surname on the headstone. The hairs go up on the back of my neck even now when I think of it. But my response surprised me. I stood there and wept. For half an hour I cried. I cried for my mother, herself only a child of 18 at the time. I cried for my father, who could never really show affection because he was never shown love as a child. And I cried for that little baby. And I think I even cried for that land that's seen so much turmoil over the centuries. But I realised in that moment that if the fear was theirs and not mine, maybe I could choose to let go of it. Because everything in life comes down to a choice. Do you remember Neo in The Matrix? Could take the blue pill, study, nice steady job, work towards a pension. Nothing wrong with that. Or you take the red pill, confront your fears, dive into your experiences, take a risk, get up, get knocked down, get up again. Now, I should just issue a spoiler alert. I didn't take the blue pill. This would have been a very short speech. And if you remember, I said that I grew up in a tough environment. Well, it didn't help that when I was little, I was a very sickly, skinny, effeminate little boy. Oh, come, give me a break. No, nobody's perfect. But I survived the inevitable bullying, and I survived school, and I hated it. And I left school as soon as I could, and age 15, with no qualifications, I got a job with no prospects, but it paid me enough money to indulge in my love of music and dancing. So I was clubbing 7 nights a week. I know, hard life. And all with increasing amounts of alcohol and anything else I could swallow to numb my mind. But I did okay. I got married, had 2 children, had a successful travel business, flying all around the world, sometimes on Concorde, and always staying in 5-star hotels. So on the outside, I had everything. Inside, I was being eaten away because I wasn't me. Things came to a head beginning of 1989. I was at another convention in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, and I'd always wanted to see Machu Picchu. So after it, I flew across to Peru, and on the first morning in the ancient Inca capital of Cusco, I went for a walk, and this time I went and walked down some quiet back roads. And I suddenly felt a hand grab my hair and yank my head back, and a fist smashed into my throat, and a man was squeezing my throat. I was passing out. I was being mugged by 3 men. I kicked out and caught one of them on the side of the face, which for some strange reason seemed to annoy him a bit. And the last thing I remember was a lump of concrete attached to his hand as it came smashing into my face. I don't think I was unconscious for more than about 1 minute, maybe 2. And I remember waking up on the wet cobbles, and there was an ever-increasing pool of red coming from where my nose had been. And I was aware of somebody fiddling with my feet. I looked down, and an old lady was stealing my shoes. And I remember, that image stuck with me. I remember thinking, how desperate must you be to do that? So there's another person who impacted on my life without them ever knowing it. So I staggered back to the hotel, got patched up, and 2 days later, looking like a tall panda with 2 black eyes and a white plaster over my nose, I carried on to Machu Picchu. I sat in the ruins there for what seemed like hours, and I remember letting go of a lot of emotion and just clearing my mind. It was probably my first meditation. As a practice, I carried on. And then I continued on the train journey up through the Andes to Puno and across Lake Titicaca into Bolivia. And I checked into a hotel on the lakeside. And before going to bed, I booked a wake-up call because everyone had said to me, the sunrise over the lake is spectacular. So I went back to my room, which like the others was on stilts on the lake, and opened the door, and inside was a big basket of strawberries and a huge, I think it must have been a magnum, of Chilean champagne on ice. I thought, breakfast sorted. The manager had taken pity on me, there was a note. So I got the wake-up call, got wrapped up against the cold, went onto the balcony. And what I hadn't appreciated, as the sun came up, the backdrop was some snow-capped mountains. And as the sun reflected off of the mountains onto the lake, for a few fleeting moments, the whole vista, 360 degrees, turned pink. I was standing on the biggest pink birthday cake in the entire world. It was and remains one of the most beautiful things I think I've ever seen. And I remember the words of existential philosopher Albert Camus. In the depths of winter, I discovered I had within me an invincible summer. Because had I not had the dark days a few days before, would I have appreciated the beauty of the lake? I finished off the champagne, and all of it, and very drunk, hitched a lift in the back of the laundry truck bound for La Paz. And as I fell asleep on the bags of dirty laundry, inspired by what I just witnessed, I resolved that when I got back, I would do what I'd been putting off my whole life, and I changed gender. Now, in 1989, whilst I was getting ready for the world wasn't quite ready for me. My mother had a really interesting take on it. She said, "But it's not normal." I said, "You're right there, Mum. But painting like Michelangelo isn't normal. Writing like Charles Dickens or Oscar Wilde isn't normal. Maybe normal's not so hot." Thank you. And But work was challenging. My business had already been struggling. And a typical response was this from a client. He said, look, we really like you and you've done some great work for us, but we can't have our brand associated with somebody like you. So we think it's time for a change. The ultimate irony, time for a change. I thought, well, that's one thing we agreed on. But it wasn't long before my business I had to liquidate it with huge debts. And 2 weeks later, my mother died. And my father told me he didn't want me to go to the funeral. I went, but not in the shiny black car with the family. I sat in the back with my partner and 2 wonderful children. But notice what I just said. I sat in the back. I wasn't sent there at gunpoint. We shame ourselves sometimes. I bought into the shame. And we don't have to. But anyway, shortly afterwards, I went into a big spiral, got very depressed, and I took an overdose. As you can see, I was as good at self-destruction as I was at running a business. And by the way, I didn't really want to die. I couldn't figure out how to live. I work with suicidal people a lot. It's a common theme. So, and my partner said the most important words to me that anybody's ever said before or since. So don't you ever dare try and desert your children again. See, I was so full of self-pity, I'd lost sight of what I had. I had a beautiful family. I nearly threw it away. So you can imagine how I felt in 2008 when I applied for equal rights with other women, and I was told, yes, you can, but you have to annul your marriage. Why would I do that? So I challenged it through the courts. I went to a tribunal and lost. They said, there's no point in appealing. So I appealed. And lost again. And again they said there's no point in appealing. There's a theme developing here if you listen carefully. But at this point I got a wonderful pro bono barrister. And shortly afterwards we were joined by 2 amazing solicitors. And a further 4 or 5 stages later, we were in the Court of Appeal in the High Court, and they referred the case to the Supreme Court. And we were then joined by one of the top barristers in the United Kingdom. These 4 people worked for me for years for no fee. How humbling is that? I mean, these were top people. And the Supreme Court referred the case to the European Court of Justice for their opinion. This whole process at this point had taken 10 years. Well, you can't rush these things. And so there I was a few months later, walking into this brand new building in Luxembourg, the European Court of Justice. And we were in the main court. And I remember walking in, there was cedar panelling everywhere. You could smell the varnished newness. So if you imagine I'm in the front of the court and there's a centre aisle, and behind me were the 17 ermine-clad judges in an arc. And in front of them, various court officials in robes and so on. On this side, the first 2 rows were filled with the barristers representing the government. And then the rows behind were solicitors, press, civil servants, and various other people. It was about 120. On this side were my 2 amazing barristers, my 2 equally wonderful solicitors, and the rest was empty. Knowing as I do that shame needs the oxygen of secrecy, I decided to be visible, and I sat halfway down next to the aisle. And I looked across at the array of barristers and solicitors on the other side, and I could have thought we've got no chance. But I knew I had an amazing team who believed in what we were doing. We had them worried. Different mindset. And I sat there, and throughout that day, every time my name was mentioned, or some derogatory term was used to describe me, I felt the eyes of the court on me, and I would turn to them and smile. Any residual shame I felt disappeared that day, and fear, starved of its codependent love of shame, died with it, and was replaced by my growing sense of self. And I looked in the front at my legal team, and I realised, when we stand up for something, you can hear I feel emotional about it now. When we stand up for something, not just good, but amazing people join us. That was a huge lesson for me. So several months later, the decision came back through the Supreme Court. We'd won. We actually won. Yeah. Yeah. Amazing. And I'm not going to pretend I did it for anyone else. I just did it for me. But the decision was binding in 17 countries. So something happened. But you know, the most important thing I think that I want to say is it was never just about equal rights for me. It was about my human right to define who I am. Nobody defines me but me, and I would suggest to you, nobody should ever define you but you. It's your right as a human being. You know, everyone's sick of these, aren't they? There's somebody in front going, what's that? You know, we're masks. And yet, not most, but a lot of people I meet wear an invisible mask for their whole lives. See, when you take the mask off and you reveal yourself, you take back your power. Because you don't reveal yourself to others, you reveal it to you. And that's when the magic begins. Don't wait as I did until it was the only option. Do it now. Because when you face your fear, you'll deal with your shame, and you can then choose to connect with the things that you value most and make the contribution that only you can make. It's what we call purpose. And when you do that, you feel fulfilled. Because happiness and success that I started with, that's transient. Fulfillment is lasting. So don't wait until you're ready. Don't wait until you've got enough money, until the kids are grown up, till you've done enough courses, read enough books. Do it now, because when you step up and step in the game, you find out who you are. And as I discovered, not just good, but amazing people will join you. And that's the most rewarding thing. See, ultimately, what have we got left? Ourselves. With all our wonderfulness and all our flaws, all our humanity. But remember, you possess all you'll ever need. Just tap into those gifts you already have and become not just the person, but the amazing person you already are. You see, we need it in 2022. Dare to be you, because I really think that's an idea worth spreading. Thank you.